Hey guys, Jameson and Cricket here. Welcome back to the Nordic Sound. So today I've got an album review for you guys, and that is the long-awaited Keel Road from the incredible Danish String Quartet. Now, a little bit of background, just because we don't give classical music or the classical music world nearly enough attention on the Nordic Sound like we used to, and that is something I'm going to try and do better at with my mission of covering as much Nordic music as possible across genres, styles, generations, and traditions. So the Danish String Quartet is a quartet from Denmark, made up of some of the most incredible world-class musicians that you can find. We have Rune Sørensen on the violin. You might also know him from Dreamer's Circus. Fredrik also on the violin. Asbjørn Nørgaard on the viola, and Fredrik Sjølin on the cello. Now, this string quartet has been around for such a long time, decades actually. But my first encounter with them was when I was just a young, budding music student at my small state college in New Hampshire. All I knew is that I love folk music, but I was in a classical music system just because that's what you do if you want to major in music in the States. And then I also liked Nordic stuff. But I had this weird dynamic where I couldn't really find many Nordic musicians to listen to in the classical music world, and that is honestly a huge reason why I started this channel in the first place and what sent me down the path that I'm on. But the Danish String Quartet was actually sort of my saving grace in that conflict that I had. I was getting really interested in Nordic music, Nordic culture, that sort of thing. I needed more Nordic classical music to listen to that wasn't just Grieg, as much as you guys know, I think the world of Grieg is my favorite composer. But then also, not a lot of ways for an American to get into Nordic folk music. And here comes the string quartet that gives me literally the best of all of these worlds through the album Woodworks that came out when I believe I was a sophomore, second year of college, if I'm remembering correctly. And that album really could not have come at a more important time for me to need that album. And so ever since then, the Danish String Quartet has actually had such a central part of my music life and career, and I listen to Woodworks all the time. It was the very first CD I bought with my own working money, and I still have that CD on my CD shelf today. I listen to it way more often than some of my other CDs in my collection. And then in 2017, I came out. It was just more of what I love. They have that beautiful rendition of that Danish folk song that they've titled Last Leaf, and there's so much more to love in that. They also have their own version of Drømte meg en drøm, which is the oldest written down melody we have from Scandinavia, at least the oldest folk melody we have written down from Scandinavia. And so for a long time, these guys have really been a very clear window for me to look into the Scandinavian tradition, both in folk music and classical music, and that is why I would really love to showcase them here right now for you guys, especially if you find yourselves in the same situation. The Danish String Quartet is really just such a one-size-fits-all solution to a lot of people who want to get into Nordic music. And so for that reason, I'm really happy that I finally get to talk about a new album from them, because new original music from the Danish String Quartet is few and far between. Woodworks was 2014, if I'm remembering correctly. Then Ærømester was 3 years later, 2017. And now in 2024 is just the next time that we've gotten original music from them. So it's been, what is that, 7 years? And between they do classical music albums, which are great, I love them. But to me, just the huge highlight of the String Quartet are these albums they do of mostly original material or arrangements of folk tunes. And so with all that background, here we are now in 2024, and we finally have Keel Road in our hands. Now, I actually had a pretty special first encounter with this album actually already, and that is because my father and I had the opportunity to actually see the Danish String Quartet right here in Boulder in the incredible Chautauqua House that's at the foot of the Flatirons here in Boulder, which is probably one of the most beautiful locations where you can experience their music here, and especially if you consider their philosophy behind Woodworks. It's actually like a strangely animist philosophy behind that for a classical quartet. The power of wood and the role that wood has had in music traditions around the world. The Chautauqua House is this purely wooden building that was an old lodge or dining hall for settlers back in the 1800s. and that is the setting in which we got to experience their music. So I really do not think there's a more beautiful setting here in the Boulder area to experience their music. Red Rocks not included. But at this concert, they opened up with a Haydn and a Schumann string quartet, but then in the second half of the program, all it said was folk music. And as a part of that enigmatic label, folk music in the second half of their program after the intermission was actually quite a bit of music off of Keel Road, and I was just in awe of how amazing it was to not only be seeing the string quartet for the first time, but to actually be hearing a lot of this music early that I have been very much awaiting for so many years. Tunes that they played include the Fair Isle Jig, Once a Shoemaker, which we already had a single to, Regen Smither, which is going to be a tune that some of you diehard Tyr fans, or just metalheads in general, are going to love, because it's, of course, Regen Smither, the smith Regen from the tale of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. So thematically, you can see that they're still diving back far into history too, not just in like this largely 19th century folk tradition that we know of from Scandinavia. They sort of go all over the place stylistically. And that is also something I really love about Keel Road in general, because you can trace this development from Woodworks through Iromaser into Keel Road, where, in those first two albums, you can tell the focus is definitely Scandinavian Nordic traditions. You have some of like the Scottish Isles and Shetland melodies sneak in there out of left field every now and again, but largely those first two records were dedicated to Scandinavian and Nordic tradition. What Keel Road is doing is expanding outward, in much the same way Kusnarth, the new album from Floating Sofa Quartet, is doing, is branching out to not just the Scandinavian, not just the Nordic, but to look at sort of like the shared DNA between all of these North Atlantic folk traditions, right? Because none of these communities, none of these folk traditions developed in a bubble. They were a part of this broader network of sharing music and sharing traditions and styles all across Europe. And before recorded music, the main highway of, transmitting information is the ocean. The ocean is the highway of Europe before the advent of actual highways. And so you would primarily hear new things from coastal towns, and it would work outwards from there. And so Keel Road is in a lot of ways focusing on that shared DNA that sort of traveled the North Atlantic, that gave us a lot of the music traditions and the repertoire that we have today. What I really love about this slight shift of perspective for Keel Road compared to the previous albums is that not only is it allowing these world-class musicians to give yet another opportunity to display their versatility, as if this string quartet has not only shown they're one of the most versatile string quartets on the planet, being able to shift so effortlessly between Scandinavian folk tradition and just really high-class classical music performances that are on par with the best classical quartets in the world. It's further showing their strengths and their versatility by now branching outwards into Celtic and British Isle traditions as well. From every direction, there's just so many reasons why it seems like we waited a long time for Keel Road, because it's a little bit more ambitious than previous Danish String Quartet albums. A broader variety in styles and traditions, and even timelines working with, going so back to the Faroe ballad Regen Smither, which is medieval, or at least very soon after the Middle Ages. Just working with a lot of material here, but somehow, this is one of the strengths of this record, the Danish String Quartet just has these tunes flow seamlessly into one another. You guys know how much I really value coherence in an album, and all three of their albums now, including Keel Road, they work profoundly in that way. Just the way that you never really feel like you've gone from one track to the next. Instead, it just feels like you are just immersing yourself in this experience, and you can't really tell where one begins and one ends. And I only mean that in like a positive way. But then another aspect of this is that we actually get to see Rune Sørensen on more than just the violin. He plays the clog fiddle on Once a Shoemaker, which is just another tune that just brought me to tears at the live show. And also, he plays the Hardingfele on the Halling, the one Norwegian tune, which I always find funny because the Danish String Quartet market themselves as three Danes and one Norwegian, the Norwegian being the cellist. And I just love that they lean into that, sort of sibling humor between the Scandinavian countries. But so we have this wide variety of styles and traditions, and we see Rune actually flexing his versatility on something like the clog fiddle and then, the Hardanger fiddle as well. And so this is just much more of like an adventure than previous albums, I feel like. The way that I think that the ambitiousness of this project really pays off is that even in the press release for this album, they write that for them, folk music is not just repertoire. It's a part of who they are as musicians. And as someone who is mostly a folk musician, but I'm also a musicologist trained in like the classical, in the classical tradition, it can be really awkward when classical musicians think like, oh, it's just fiddling, you know, how hard can it be? And then they just do this really robotic, passionless performance of some traditional repertoire. And that's always a danger with classical musicians who want to sort of, you know, dip their toes into also playing folk music. I've seen it firsthand. You know, I was at Peabody Conservatory for 2 years, and you can kind of see that it's not a transition that's as easy as a lot of classical musicians think it would be, right? It requires a passion and an understanding and a genuine love of the tradition to actually play it well, and for it to register and resonate with the people who already listen to that tradition, right? And as I said in their press release, they are really highlighting how important it is to them that they are expressing a genuine love for the folk music, because they themselves are folk musicians in a lot of ways. And so if you really take that mission statement and run with it, right, that mission statement that classical musicians have a lot to gain from having a genuine understanding and passion for this folk music, and sort of like, you know, expressing a sort of folk musician mentality through your classical music playing, Keel Road is another step on the way of sort of that development of them, of sort of like reaching out and demonstrating this real genuine love and passion for folk music traditions. Because Iromaser and Woodworks start in the Scandinavian, what they know, but you see that they're not content with just being the string quartet that also plays Nordic folk music, right? With Keel Road, they're branching outward to sort of explore that shared DNA and the beauty of these music traditions that do have that shared origin in the highway of the sea. And I think the track that highlights this the best really is Stormpolskan. It really is the most unique track on the album, and I think I know why. And it's because when you have this relationship between classical music and folk music, you know, people will usually just rest or stop at saying, yeah, they mix classical and folk music. But when you actually stop and think, it's just like, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to mix classical music and folk music? Is it just playing a traditional melody arranged for a string quartet? Or is it performing music with this sort of like laid back or rustic or homely, you know, attitude of a folk musician? In truth, like, there's no one answer for what it means to mix classical music or folk music, but I don't think anyone, especially musicians, really prod that question enough. But here we have the Danish String Quartet sort of tackling that very same question with Stormpolskan. It's how do you embody the folk tradition in a classical music setting with a string quartet? And in Stormpolskan you have a polska, right, that 3-beat reel, putting it very simply, but also sort of in between the more folk-sounding ways you're really flexing your muscles as a virtuosic string quartet and showing this dance between the classical and the folk, right? And it doesn't have any answers, I don't think, but at least it poses the question is, are we happy with just saying sometimes musicians mix classical and folk music? Or do we want to sort of like ask how they do it? Or in what ways can classical music and folk music interact with each other? And in a lot of ways, that's why I think Stormpolskan is, at least rhetorically, a really incredible piece of music, right? Because it really has us questioning, you know, what does it mean? What can it mean? The interaction between folk and classical music, the reason I'm really bringing this up is because that really has defined Scandinavian music for centuries. You know, Ole Bull, Edvard Grieg, Johan Sørensen, Johan Halvorsen, all of these musicians who are trained classically have, since the 1800s, been sort of defining Scandinavian classical music by the way that it interacts with folk music in a way that doesn't have an ounce of shame to it. And in a lot of ways, instead, it's pride, but it's also not pastiche. Okay, I'm accidentally overcomplicating this with musicological jargon out of habit, sorry. But if I can make sure that I'm communicating what I want to be communicating here, it's very simply that the dance between classical music and folk music has pretty much defined Scandinavian music since the 1800s, okay? And so in that way, what the Danish String Quartet is doing is just continuing that conversation that has been just a part of the DNA of Nordic music for centuries and generations. And so if that dance does, in a lot of ways, define Nordic music, that's why I really think a lot of you here on the Nordic Sound who want to sort of dive deeper into the questions of Nordic music, the Danish String Quartet is probably one of the best places to start in terms of actually listening and sort of like hearing all the ideas and philosophies and you know, cultural traditions put into practice, right, of that dance between folk music and classical music. So I think I have fawned over this record long enough and the Danish String Quartet long enough. So gonna end it here and just say I really hope that you give this album a listen. Really looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about it, because as I said, if you were here on the Nordic Sound, you probably have a lot to gain from listening to this album, because it definitely continues a lot of conversations that we've been having on the channel and that Nordic musicologists will be having for generations to come. So guys, let me know what you thought of the album. Are you familiar with the Danish String Quartet? If you are from the classical side, listening to them, how does it make you feel, and vice versa? How do you feel as a folk musician listening to the Danish String Quartet? I would just love to continue the conversation down in the comments. All right, so that is my review-ish of the Danish String Quartet's Keel Road, and I will talk to you guys soon.